Good morning, afternoon, good evening, good night. Our guest tonight is Mr. Phil Fox. How are you, sir?
Doing well. Doing well. How are you?
Not too bad.
I'm doing well myself. So, um, what you been up to lately?
You talking to me?
Hmm?
Okay. Yeah, not much actually. I've been uh sort of taking a sort of a small hiatus from my own platform. Usually I go live on Sundays at 4 o'clock Eastern, but I've been sort of just taking a small break because it's been we've been going pretty hard for about a year and a half, steady, and trying to build the platform and trying to sort of find where our groove is, and so we've sort of found a place and um, just trying to recalibrate and line up some more guests and stuff like that, and sort of just sort of refocus and take some time and spend some time with the family and that kind of stuff. So I've been, so yeah, I've just been basically just taking a little bit of time off. Just, but with that said, I've actually had more guest appearances on other platforms and other channels. Sort of like this, just having this just different dialogues and conversations and stuff like that. So, um, but yeah, so I just been um, staying busy, doing apologetics work, and also busy with my family and my day job and all that kind of stuff too. So,
Well,
All
tell
right.
tell the dear audience all about that and your background and what led you to Christ and up to today.
yeah, so yeah, I've um, for some folks who may or may not know me, my name is Mr. Phil Fox. You can find me on all the social medias, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube under Mr. Phil Fox, all one word, MrPhilFox. And sort of the area that I've focused on and that I focus on is apologetics, um, and also doing ministry for Native American people. And and that's my background. Is I'm full blood Native American from the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara tribes out of North Dakota, and it was through some missionaries and their missionary work that I was able to come to Christ. I was led to Christ and deliver the gospel, and it was sort of through all of that, and and it was also through that ministry that I was and the connections that the ministry had that that I was able to go to school, and I went to Bible college and got my biblical foundations diploma, and really sort of set the foundation up for me to be able to grow in Christ and really uh, gain a lot of understanding about the gospel of Christ and a lot of the basic tenets of the faith, and then sort of go from there. So it set me up for a lot of uh, just my personal life and personal study and my personal faith and growing and understanding as to what it means to be a Christian, and not only just a native Christian, but just a Christian in general. There's just a lot of baggage that's involved, not only for just being just the cultural identity of being Native American, but also just in general. So it's sifting through a lot of those types of things, and so that's sort of where the focus and my brand is really just trying to help people reconcile. Not only I do have the spin of being a native Christian, but I do have a unique perspective of being a native Christian that can help people from all different cultural backgrounds, because there are pieces of the walk that are universal. So there's things that I can grab that may be unique, and that might be able to help people to truly, sort of see it from a different perspective, because the tendency of the church is just to sort of latch on to several key issues, and then sort of sort of filter that, or use use this general overview of the gospel. um and it's they sort of leave people to just sort of walk on your own, and there's also sort of the legalism aspect as well. You
Yeah.
don't drink, smoke, or chew, or go with girls who do, type of mentality. Or there's the list, right? You can't drink, you can't do this, you can't, you're always sort of siphoning your thought and all this kind of stuff. And there's just, there's all this legalistic type stuff that's involved that sometimes can be counterproductive to your overall walk in Christ. So it's sort of being minority and being, having these other views sort of helps to sort of squash some of those prerequisites, if you will, um, and some of the stereotypical, views, because it's it's difficult being, an ethnic minority in the United States, but having a rich culture of of faith, and having a rich culture of spirituality, and coming from that background, because those are things that aren't usually seen, because it's always written off basically by dominant culture Christianity as, oh, that's just heathen stuff, or that's unredeemed stuff. Whereas, there is a cultural apologetic that you could really apply to that. And if you get to know some of these things, there's some beauties and some things, I think, that Native people, and not just Native people, but I mean just different cultures, excuse me, different cultures in general, would be able to teach the body of Christ as a whole. But instead, the church has chosen to sort of take, this is what Christianity is, and it usually has a sort of a European type bent to it, and it sort of, it fails to see some of those things. So with those perspectives in mind, and all of those things, is where my ministry sort of falls into its sort of niche, if you will, to be able to show these things and communicate a lot of the truths of the gospel from a different perspective. So yeah, so that's a little bit about what I'm about, and what my ministry is called Drops of Hope Ministries. And that sort of even that name within itself, it the sort of the background behind that is, because uh, historically Native American people aren't readers. uh, Most of our traditions and our stories and our language and the songs and everything is passed down orally.
Yeah.
So there's not really a written language per se. So it was difficult. It's always difficult to get people in general, to read their Bibles. But there's an added layer to that when you're talking about the native Christian, because native people just aren't inclined to read. So we're more of a oral tradition type. But I mean, that's that sort of falls in line too with the narrative of the Old Testament, right? Though there are people, even though they had the Old Testament, the Torah, and all these things,
Mhm.
like they still were inaudible people. Like the scrolls were meant to be read out loud. The traditions were meant to be read out loud. That was the custom of the time. So they weren't all readers as well. So there's a very strong oral tradition even within early Christianity. And so it's some of those things, that are you can take those apologetic approaches, and sort of show the parallels with some of these things. But with that said, so my ministry started as sort of a small blog, like a 2-minute read type of thing. And it was on Facebook, and I was looking for something, basically what to call it. I didn't know what it was. But on the reservations, typically there's a sense of hopelessness. You look at some of the statistics with Native people and reservations, you're 2 to 3 times more likely to commit suicide if you're on a reservation.
Damn.
You're and that's even above any other demographic within the national averages. So you think of inner cities, places where very depressed communities and those types of things. So even when thinking of that, reservations have a higher rate, 2 to 3 times higher. You think of the health. It's hard for these people to get food, and that was by design. There is some things that happened within the history, and reservations were placed in areas that were far away from any types of resources. So there's real life implications there, and that's still true today. So the reservation I grew up, and the town that I grew up in, we were an hour away from any Walmart. So it was hard for us to get resources to eat properly. Uh, so so for us to have, fresh vegetables or forget some kind of, and many of us would grow our own. And there's farms and stuff like that who would grow their own produce, but having an organic market or any of that kind of stuff close, that forget about it. And then, the closest town for us to get gas was around, and on my town, there'd be times where we wouldn't have gas. So we'd have to travel 30 miles to get fuel.
Oh,
And then not only that, but you're talking about like a mom and pop grocery store. And so the mom and pop grocery store, what does that mean? So that means they're paying not wholesale price, but they're paying consumer price, and then they're bringing it back to their store to sell for a profit in order to keep their so so there's all these added things just to get food and all this stuff. So we live an hour and a half away from a Walmart where we can pay Walmart prices, but that there's an added burden there. You have to have a vehicle. A lot of people come from poverty, so things like diabetes and heart disease and all this stuff are rampant because we have to have food that's going to last a long time, right? So what does that mean? That means it's stuff that's canned or has a ton of preservatives in it. So then now now we're talking salt and you're talking all these very unhealthy things, but they have a very long shelf life because there's some people on the reservation that really can't even get out, and or they don't have the means to really shop on a daily basis. Like now, my family and I live in Michigan, where we have like literally just around the corner, 2-minute drive, a 10-minute walk. We have a fresh produce farmers market right next to us. But see, that's the thing is that we have that choice, but they don't on the reservation.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
so there's a lot of these things that bring and draw this idea of hopelessness. And so
Mhm.
what I wanted to do is I wanted to bring drops of hope. So
hope.
the drops portion is these little nuggets of truth and hope. And where does the hope lie? The hope lies in Christ and in Jesus.
Right.
And so and then uh and so that's the hope, and then the drop is these small nuggets. And then so it started as this blog on Facebook, and then I built a website, and then now it's sort of morphed into this whole internet thing. And I've always done speaking engagements and those types of things because I was a pastor as well.
Mhm.
And I didn't always focus on apologetics, but so I've you know I and we've done some stuff where we've sort of focused on the Native American aspect of it, but that's not the that's because that's kind of a niche of what our ministry does, but we're really universal as far as what our ministry focus is. We don't just focus on Native American issues per se. That's just sort of the niche that we're in. But our focus and drive is really to bring the message of the gospel and to contextualize it for all people, all men, for all time.
Yeah. I also believe that Native Americans, have, at least from a historical perspective that I know of, have had somewhat of a, there's a lot of rituals that they do that involve the rain. And it does seem to be like, at least in some of the stuff I've read about it, it's, they do have a very intimate connection with nature like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so there's sort of sometimes there can be like a misconception, where people see um that connection with Mother Nature, and the emphasis on stewardship. That really is like a very it's a very real thing. But the problem is that people begin to sort of mysticize it, right? And just sort of like how what a lot of people do with even the scripture in the Bible and things in the Bible, right? Especially like the New Testament, the Book of Acts, miracles, and all these types of things. Like, there is a sense of supernaturalism, which obviously, because God is a supernatural being. Um, but there tends to be the sense of mysticism that Native Americans, for whatever reason, have this. They can make it rain, or they can do it. It's really just the idea of and most tribes would say this, is that it's not necessarily like they have power over, but there can be a real sense of sort of a synchronizing, where you have a really good idea of like I can do a lot of things, like not a lot of things, but like one thing that I can do that my even my kids thought was weird for a long time is like I can smell the rain when it's coming. Like you can just sort of smell that in the air, like the rain's coming. And my kids sort of look at me like weird, like okay. But like even now, like it just takes a little bit of practice, and you can sort of sense it in the air, and you can feel it. But it doesn't mean there's any type of, it's just a common thing. I grew up in the Midwest, where there wasn't a lot of smog in the air, and the air was a little more clean, and you could see for miles. And so you can sort of, there's signs that you can see of the weather, and it's not a mystical thing. It's just you sort of just have these senses, and you can smell it, and you can see it coming, and all those types of things. So it's really just a sensitivity to nature. So yeah, as far as the and that's I don't know of very many tribes that actually have sort of a quote unquote rain dance, and that's kind of one of those things that people sort of stereo I don't know how you would word it, but it's a stereotype, and it's stereotypical sometimes, where people think, oh, every tribe has because they're Indian, they do the rain dance, but that's not
Yeah,
true.
like the stereotype of dancing in the rain and singing with the bears and all that. It's just
Yeah.
Well, it's either that, or they have, like, Indians really in the media get portrayed as either two things, either the rain dancers or the casino owners.
Right.
oh
That's
yeah,
pretty much that's pretty much the only two roles that they have in media.
Right. Or go ahead.
I was about to say, it used to be also the Red Warriors in those old westerns, or the peace-loving tree huggers that the people like to portray them as.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's unfortunate, because I mean, what you have to look at it honestly. What does that imply? Right? That implies that we don't exist, or the media can just sort of portray us as whatever they want to. you know, and and like one of the biggest things was the mascot issue, like the Redskins, right? I'm sure there's people that are going to be on your channel that would disagree with me, or they say it's ridiculous or whatever. And while the whole thing was going on, like there was honestly a large group of Native American people that were like, you know what, I really don't care. But
Yeah, it's like 90% of them. 90% of it was like no, we don't care, and I think at least half of them would consider it an honorable representation.
well, see, that's the thing though, is see, you have to understand why they don't care. See, because people like to say, well, they, see, they don't care. The reason why they don't care is because they have become just sort of beaten down because they do care. Uh, but the history of this country has it's silenced the voices to where we don't feel like we can win anymore. So that's why people don't care. And that's really was my position for a long time too. Was, you know what? It's not going to matter. It doesn't matter what I say because they're going to go on and do it anyway because they're the ones with the money. They're the ones who are, but it wasn't until the rest of the people started to care and really started to listen to the voices of native people, because yes, they didn't care, but it was just out of apathy. It wasn't because, oh, this is an honorable thing, whereas because the actual term redskin was a derogatory term. It was a term that was, it was, as far as the research that it was very close to the N word for African Americans. So what's honorable with that? So there's, and again, like there's things that it's difficult to get because Native Americans, we have this there's this thing where a lot of people think that we're gone and that we don't exist, or we're just part of this nation's history, and that we don't really matter. But that's the thing is I mean, I forget his name, but he was a congressman a few months ago. you know he was basically trying to say, well, this land was empty. Well, I mean, yeah, we did have the Native Americans, but still, you know
Yeah,
so it's there's that type of rhetoric that's out there, and it's not even rhetoric, it's just common knowledge that, oh yeah, there were these guys, these Native American peoples, but they were just the Indian problems, so we're sort of we took care of that, and we tidied them up, we set them up, and we set them up really good. We gave them stuff, and there's all these misconceptions like, oh, Indians don't pay taxes, or Indians, they don't have to pay for their education, or they don't have to pay for their health care and all this kind of stuff. Well, there might be some truth to that, but here the reality is that there might be health care that's for Native Americans, but can you afford, or can anybody with an entry level salary afford to sit potentially for 8 hours at the health service? These are things people don't want to talk about. These are things that people don't understand. Like, sure, yeah, it might be free healthcare, but you might have to sit, because there have been times where I literally sat for an entire workday waiting to get seen, and I had an appointment, and then they would tell me, oh well, I'm sorry, we're just not going to have time to see you today, so can you come back tomorrow? And I'm sitting there with the flu, and I can't go back to work anyway, and all this stuff. Um, so what am I supposed to do? Or God forbid, I break my leg, or I need some kind of emergency services. It's not out there. So yeah, there's all these misconceptions and derogatory things that are usually said about Native American people, but there's really no thought as to why things are that way. And so those are some of the type of things that I'm trying to show people and to tell people that, listen, we need to look at and we need to see why things are the way that they are, because not everything is just what meets the eye. There's been a huge thing about, I mean, even in pop culture, right? Dave Chappelle, right?
Yeah.
He did a skit where he was talking about, oh yeah, I've seen a mass, and I wasn't mad. I actually thought it was funny, but it just
Mhm.
sort of shows that this is the cultural idea of who Native Americans are. And he said, yeah, I had I found a meeting of where 3,600 Native Americans were, and he was like, it was in Walmart in New Mexico. And that was funny. And then the guy, he goes on, and the skit goes on, and, and he's like, so who are you, my friend? And he's like, yeah, I'm I'm a Navajo. And then he's like, oh, I thought you were, I studied you in social studies, he says. And then he's like, why, what would you call yourself? And he said, I'm an alcoholic, you know? So, there's all those stereotypical things, which, I mean, yeah, it's
Yeah, but he
funny.
does tell everybody.
Yeah. So, yeah. And I mean, it's not that I took offense to it, but I mean, it just shows, like, in pop culture, like, what's the view of Native people, there's a high percentage of alcoholism. There's a high divorce rate. There's a high, there's all these health issues within Native American people. You know what I mean? So just like I said in the opening, like, why is it that way? What are the statistics, and why is it that way?
And
And
we
go
were
ahead.
hoping to go over the history of the interactions between native people and the white man and Christendom in general, like going back to where it all began first. But go ahead back to where you were saying.
Oh yeah. No, it's just, yeah. So I mean, we do have to take a look at, and just like you're saying, like, there is a ton of history that is not told. There's a very manifest destiny type view, and what we would call, and I'm sorry, but here comes the trigger warning.
Mm-hmm.
There is a white supremacist view of America, and that doesn't mean, like, see, people, when people hear that word, they automatically start thinking of
Woke.
guys in bed sheets and people burning crosses and all that kind of stuff. But no,
Yeah.
the reality is the white superiority that was set up in this country that justified the taking and stealing of land. And there's a doctrine out there called the doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery was, it was the theological, and then it changed into legal precedents for land and ownership title for these lands. So the Pope he wrote this thing called a papal bull, and he justified the taking of the land. Now, this is a 30,000-foot view. There's a ton of information out there. Some books like Pagans in the Promised Land by Steve Newcomb is a very good book to read. Mark Charles and Soong Chang Ra wrote a book called Unsettling Truths that talk about the doctrine of discovery. Just recently, the first part of was it July or no? June, last part of June, excuse me. I think it was the 29th of June. Sarah, let me get her book because it's leaving me right now. The Land Is Not Empty by Sarah Augustine. She wrote a book, and she talks about a little more broad. She talks about the doctrine of discovery with a little more broad brush, because she has seen directly some of the effects of South America. So it's not only the English in America and the British in America, but it was also the Portuguese and the Spanish in Central and South America.
Right.
Yeah.
It started there first.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, typically, I always found the doctrine of discovery to be sort of a ad hoc sort of thing, to
Mhm.
justify what they were doing. I said
Right.
it's not really a doctrine of discovery; it's more of a doctrine of conquest.
Well, precisely.
And they weren't unique to it. But the Turks were doing all that around the same time they were doing it.
I mean, conquest is like pretty, like conquest is a pretty human thing,
Sure.
And,
which
and
goes to
that's what
show.
a lot of people don't.
Yeah, which Yeah, a question that I really wanted to get to is because, finding out you're Native American, seeing how there is a bit of a negative history between Christianity and the Native American people.
Hmm.
Uh, when you tell, like me, if you go up to a fellow Native American and you tell them that you're a Christian, is there a bit of hostility between you two? Like they see you as you've been colonized or whatever?
Yeah, yeah. There are some derogatory terms that I've been called before. I've been called an apple. Red on the outside and white on the inside, and there are some. It's pretty common now to find especially in most of Native America, you're going to find Christians, and one of the misconceptions as well is like, um, most Native Americans were actually, were I forget what the term is now, postmodern. They were sort of postmodern in their thought even before postmodernism was really a coined thing. So they and this actually stems back from even pre-contact, because there was a lot of times where they were trading customs, they were trading uh for goods, and so some of the ceremonial and traditional aspects of their life were commodities, right? So they w- they would literally trade for like food and goods and materials. They would trade a ceremony. So it'd be like you going to church and finding out, oh, these guys play they have these songs that they play, and they're unique to this particular church. So I want to buy the rights to be able to perform those songs in our church. So it was sort of that type of way. So there were certain religious ceremonies and customs, and even just, not, they didn't necessarily have to be spiritual either. They would There would be this, maybe this sort of dance that they would do that was very intriguing, and they would sell the rights to that. And so there was a lot of this conglomerate, type of activity where they would sort of piece together their own, sort of spiritual practices and customs and things like that. So bringing in Christianity wasn't that big of a deal. And there was a lot of tribes, especially first contact tribes, where people were coming to Christ left and right. But it wasn't until after these atrocities is and further on down the line, when the government started to try to take over stuff, and the church was in cahoots with that. So that's what brought a lot of the mistrust. So yes, there is a lot of mistrust, especially these new generations, because they understand and know more than any other uh, generation, because there's now been a push for a lot of native tribes and younger people to try to get a understanding or a hold of their old way spirituality, is probably the best way to coin it. Um, so there is sort of a hostility, and there is sort of this idea of you've been colonized, but they don't really use that terminology, but it is that essence, right? So there can be, but it's not on the front end. It's because most native people, like I said, they have the postmodern thought already. So what they'll say is, "Oh, that's good. I'm glad that you believe that way. That's good for you, right?" So here comes that postmodern thought, because now if you try to proselytize them and communicate them and evangelize them, then that's where the pushback comes in. Well, that's good for you, but I like to believe my old ways, my ancient ways. And they sort of throw that in your face, like, oh, our ways were here first, so therefore they're ancient. And see, that's where I really am grieved by the church, and them really not building a proper apologetic to really try to understand and know these people. Because if you could see, there's a lot of beauties and there's a lot of parallel to Old Testament or New Testament, early New Testament Christianity. right? Because there's a lot of things that were very communal. They looked at the community first. They took care of one another. They were slow to anger. There was a lot of the attributes that Christ himself had preached. And these are tenets that are embedded within the culture of most tribes. But because it didn't look like, walk like, act like, speak like European, automatically it was viewed as uh, pagan, and they were nothing but savages or whatever. You know what I mean? Because they didn't wear the same type of clothing. So unfortunately, like yes, it is those types of things, and those are real. Those are real hurdles. They're not just simply, people being hurt for the sake of being hurt. Like, and these things aren't just things of the past. Because most people just see these as, oh, well, Indians, they dressed that way hundreds of years ago, or that's how they were hundreds of years ago. But listen, I was raised by a boarding school survivor. You've
Yeah, I've
probably read
heard
and
all
heard.
sorts
And
of horror stories about those boarding schools.
yes, and so I was raised. My grandmother is the one who raised me, and she was a boarding school survivor, and she would tell me stories. And here's the thing: is I was big because my grandmother was she was one of the more respected elders within our community, and since I'm her oldest grandson, I have a responsibility to understand and know not only the customs and but all our family ways. So how and I'm going to be the next person up when it's time for my generation to take over. I'm going to have the responsibility and duties to understand and know how we're supposed to do certain things. And so my unique perspective is, look, I'm going to get to influence an entire generation of my family and essentially my entire community because I'm a Christian. So I'm going to eventually get to hold that position. And it's not like I'm a chief or any type of thing, but it's just because of who I am within my family. And I come from one of the biggest families within my community. But not only that, I also come from one of the most respected families in my community. So people would come to my grandmother for advice, and literally it was reminiscent as serving as who would be the pastor, right? You would go to your pastor for advice. You'd go to your pastor for guidance. You're struggling with certain things, even something like financially. There would be times where people would come to my grandmother and they'd be like, look, listen, I don't have anything. I want to sell you this thing. And they would just need help with gas money or whatever. So they would literally come to my grandmother for these types of things. So in natural progression, I'm in line because I'm the oldest of my entire generation, and so that I have that unique responsibility. So because I have Christ, and because I am, I am a follower of Him, I have that unique opportunity to really to show people, and it's already happening. There's already things happening where my oldest uncle of his generation, of my mother's generation, he's already gone on, and he's sort of already passed the torch to me. So there's things like funerals and family gatherings and those types of things that I am going to be responsible for, uh, to help organize and to make sure proper procedures are and protocols are brought in place and those types of things. So yeah, so I guess I'm sort of meandering, but I'm just trying to give you as big of a context as I can to sort of show you, like, this is why there's hostility. This is
Think
why, because there are things that are just sort of written off by the church community when they can see the beauty. Like, listen, like, there's just imagine if somebody came to you and told you everything about your family or the things that you value are just completely trash, and you need to trash all of it, and you need to follow this particular way. And we all do that to an extent, right?
that's
Because we
what's
do
what
have
the
to. Go
that's what
ahead.
the people are trying to do to society today.
Right. And so there's all this backlash, and and there's just whether it's in, and there's this sort of political push too. You know what I mean? So there's the political aspect of that too. So there's all these differing views, but my goal is to hopefully people can get, whether you're native or whether you're dominant culture, European, Euro ethnic background, Asian, doesn't matter what you are. My goal is to show people using my culture that Christ is king, not the government. I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat. I don't hold to any of that because I think both are trash.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
actually both parties are so sold out to the white superiority aspect of this. And how do I say that? And why do I say that? Because
In different ways.
yes, and in completely different ways, absolutely. But they're sold out to the idea because why? Because they both defend the founding documents, and the founding documents were tailored for only one people group. And you can say, well, but see, here's the thing: is you can legislate the rules, but you can't legislate the heart. So people try to say, well, racism was dead, and we don't treat people like that anymore. Okay, you can change the laws, but you cannot change people's hearts. And that's just the reality. So just because of the stroke of the pen and slavery was done away with, does that mean everyone changed their views at the stroke of that pen? Heck no. You know what I mean? And it's the
Well,
same thing.
well, technically, it wasn't really done away with. It was just shifted to the prison system.
Exactly.
I mean, I guess their problem wasn't that slavery was a thing. It was that it was businessmen doing it and not the government.
Right. Well, and there's documented redlining.
Mhm.
People couldn't get home loans, or they couldn't get backed up on their home loans because they had to make sure. I mean, there was this article in, I can't remember, I think it was NBC News, talking about this wall here because I live in Detroit, in the Detroit area, and there's this wall that's reminiscent. And the reason why it was put up was simply because there was a redlined area, and this white developer wanted to develop this land, and he's seen an opportunity. So his idea was to erect this stone wall. It wasn't just like a fence. It was literally like like a 6 foot or 8 foot stone wall that literally segregated the two neighborhoods. I mean, it's still there, and the city of Detroit, they put it as a historical site now, so it's preserved. But it's documented. I mean, these types of things, there's all these things, but nobody wants to talk about those types of things. Nobody wants to talk about the idea, so they talk about Abraham Lincoln, and the westward expansion is what they call it, right? U.S. expansion. Oh, it was so good. And even John Wayne himself, the great American folk hero, I posted an article that he did in Playboy back in 1971. And in this article, he said, you know, basically, and I'm paraphrasing his quote, but essentially he said, like, look, people needed land, and so the natives were being selfish by not wanting to give that land up, you know, and that was the mentality. And so we think of Abraham Lincoln and expansion and the Homesteading Act, the Homestead Act that he signed into law, uh, which displaced hundreds of thousands of Native American people. That's not talked about. It's Western expansion. But really, what is it? Let's call it what it is. That's ethnic cleansing. So hundreds of thousands of people died during the Trail of Tears. But the Trail of Tears wasn't the only trail that was walked. There was tens and tens of and probably even hundreds of long walks that aren't documented. And one of the staging areas was Danville, Illinois. And the place that I'm sitting now is actually the original homeland of the Potawatomi people. And they were a smaller tribe of 3,500, and they lost 200 people from the walk from the Detroit area, which where they were staged because there was a fort here in Detroit, and they were staged here in Detroit and walked to Danville, Illinois, which is, several hundred miles. And they lost 200 people of like 3,500 people. That's a huge percentage. And people just think, oh, well, it was only 200 people of, that's not that much. They recovered, and I hear this rhetoric all the time, but and I use this. So if you're a homeowner, imagine if someone just came in, or my tribe just came in and said, look, we're going to take everything that you own. This whole neighborhood is now ours. And listen, I'm going to do you a favor. All right. I'm actually going to give you 10% of your home value. That's the favor I'm going to do for you, because I'm actually going to make this place better. And
that's the main tragedy about it. The Indians got screwed over.
Yeah.
They really got screwed.
And then we get blamed for why things are the way they are. Just like I said, going back to that whole thing. Now we're mascots. What?
And then there's another objection, since they'll claim, well, that's kind of, there's some grain of truth in it, that not one piece of land in America is not one Indian tribe has a monopoly on a particular land in America, since they've conquered it from other tribes who've owned it previously. So who has claim to it? That the white man was the latest one to have just conquered it, because Indians were just like everybody else. They didn't have civilization, but they lived by the rule of conquest. If you
Right.
if you wanted someone else's land badly enough, you took it, and if you couldn't defend what you have, you lost it. That sort of thing.
Right. But see, that's the thing, is that's where the misnomer breaks down, or the misinformation breaks down, because it wasn't done for ownership. It wasn't done for, most tribes were and yes, they were stealing from each other, absolutely, but they were stealing, and they were thieving from each other out of survival. So if they didn't take from this other tribe, like, yes, and that doesn't justify it in any way, and I'm not trying to justify, but that's the thing, is they weren't doing it for personal conquest, to just simply accumulate as much land as possible. That wasn't the point, and it wasn't over greed. See, that's the thing, is because most tribes and almost all tribes would take and use only what they needed. So they're not going around, let's say if it's a small band of 100 people, they're not going down and knocking down 100 buffalo just for the sake of knocking down 100 buffalo. No, they would knock down maybe 10 buffalo. That would be enough meat to feed the entire people of 100. So because they could, they would, sure, but they weren't looking at it as gain. It was simply for survival. So again, just like we do with Bible, right? We try to go as close to the cultural context to understand what it's trying to communicate. Right. People don't like to do that, even with the tribes. Why? Because it's uncomfortable for them to talk about it. So to simply say, like, and yes, like, there is critique, and there are things that I have been critical even of my own tribe. See, one of my tribes is the Hidatsa people. And the only reason why we're sort of famous, or that you might have heard of us in history, is because the Hidatsa people is where Lewis and Clark got who you would call Sacagawea.
Sacagawea, yeah.
Her name is not Sacagawea. Her name is Sagagawea. It's a Hidatsa word. It's actually my native tongue that means bird woman. So it's Sagagawea. Sagaga means bird, and then Wea. In the proper form, it's Wea, but if it was an individual form, it's M, like Mia. So her name is Sagagawea, because it's part of her name or her title. So that's her name. And Sacagawea was not a Hidatsa. She was actually a Shoshone, and she was captured by the Hidatsa when she was around 11 or 12, and she was marched from the middle of Montana to the central North Dakota. And she tells stories of that. But the Hidatsa people, my people, they don't like to tell that story. So I've been critical of that. Like, listen, we need to look at the history of Sacagawea, and we need to really tell the truth about it. And people, even I've got a lot of flack about it because I'm like, look, we want the quote unquote white man to be honest about their history and the things that they have done. So it's up to us to be intellectually honest and tell the stories and look at things that exactly the way they were. So looking at these things and just simply, trying to justify why we have this quote hatred for the white man or whatever. Like, no, we need to educate ourselves and truly be honest with our past and these things. But again, just simply saying, well, the tribes were warring with each other. That's a non-starter. You're being dishonest with your facts. Why were they warring with each other? Why were they weren't doing it for the same reason that the Europeans were, and they weren't purposely trying to dupe each other out of land and title for the sake of your and again, it's simply about superiority, right? Because this idea of race was actually generated by the Europeans as they were conquesting these lands, because they were given the God-given right by these papal bulls, so they were justified in discovering lands that were already inhabited. So, the motivations were not the same. So people need to be honest about their facts and their information.
Mm-hmm. Well, usually what I would always say
There
is,
were.
well, I mean, what I typically would say is that even if the Native Americans and the white man both warred with each other, like they warred, before and stuff, like even if we assume that they were the same reasons, that doesn't make it right.
Yeah, exactly.
I think to say, well, you Native Americans were killing each other, enslaving each other, and the like before we even came here, so therefore we were justified when we started killing you and enslaving you. I'm like, no, there's a third option. You both were wrong.
No, it doesn't make it right for anybody. Like the Apaches and the Cheyenne hate each other worse than the white man, but yeah, like you said, it was for different reasons.
Yeah,
and they weren't unique in this regard. They were, and it's kind of derogatory to paint Native Americans as one race, because
right.
Since there's like over 500 some tribes with different unique cultures, and some of them, like when the white men were fighting each other, they would ally with some would ally with the French, some would ally with the British during the colonial times, and some would ally with the Unions during the Civil War, some would fight for the Confederates, and some owned slaves, others fought against it.
Right.
Some were cowboys.
Yeah.
So it is dishonest to paint the Native Americans as just one like monolithic people.
Right.
I don't even like calling them Native Americans, because they all bear the name of an Italian explorer.
Right.
Amerigo Vespucci, the man who actually did discover America and not Columbus.
Right. Yeah.
The Vikings came there before them.
Yeah, and they were driven out. Like, the main reason why the white men won out when they were colonizing after Columbus is because they had the guns.
Yeah, superior technology, yeah.
Yeah, the history of war is really the history of technology.
Right.
Guns, germs, steel.
Although I will say the Native Americans, at least from what I've read, did put up some good fights with the white men, but it was like sort of inevitable because you're dealing with people that they have tomahawks while the other people have shotguns.
Right.
It's not it's not really a fair fight.
Right. Yeah, and it's just, you know, the population growth too was astounding. You know, and it you can look at the numbers too. There was, you know, there's some super high estimates of like 120 million native people in, you know, North America and Canada. I've seen some more conservative estimates to like, you know, 30 million roughly. And I've also the sort of the more reasonable was like around 60,000 or 60 million, possibly estimated natives. So that's sort of the median there. Um, so I mean, I don't have a problem with going with like 30 million, but even with that said, the American population of Native people around 1860 was estimated at only like 300,000, and that's huge. That's huge genocide. That I mean the worldwide
Side
population. Yeah, worldwide population growth. If you are at a 1%, you are considered not growing. And Native Americans around the time of the 1800s were at like a 0.06.
Mhm.
So they were in a massive deficit as far as their numbers growth. And I mean, there was a lot of biological warfare that was going on that also isn't talked about. You know, one of my tribes, the Mandan people, 93% life loss of the tribe due to smallpox. That stuff isn't talked about.
Mhm.
93.
That was before,
Imagine.
was
Go
that
ahead.
before germ theory was discovered?
Well, yeah, I was gonna just bring that up. I mean, yeah, it was before germ theory, but even though people did not have a concept of germs and stuff like that, they still sort of reasoned, hey, look, if I give this blanket to someone, they get sick.
Oh yeah, the
Now,
blankets incident.
now, whether or not that's germs or a demon or something, there is a connection between me giving this blanket to someone and them dying.
Precisely. Precisely. And here's the thing too, is that, you know, even within my I'm speaking specifically about my tribes, we would put people aside who were sick. So we did quarantine. So the concept of quarantine when people are sick, it wasn't just a spirit. See, that's the thing. Is people always think that, oh, because Native Americans everything was mysticized. No, we were a very practical people. And because we used herbs and these different types of stuff, because look, one of the things too is like, I always thought it was funny because people think, oh, you know, Native Americans and all the stuff that they do is hokey and whatever, but we used echinacea for years, for generations. And myself, my grandmother would say, hey, you know, I'm getting a sore throat coming on, you know, go out back and dig me up some bitter, we call it bitter root. And so I'd be like, okay, so there I would be, you know, pulling up some bitter root. And then, oh, what do you know? Uh, the late 90s, early 2000s, there's this big push for echinacea. And everyone's taking down echinacea. And there was literally these guys from these pharmaceutical companies who were buying bags of echinacea from us young folks on the reservation because we didn't know no better. And so we were digging up echinacea for these guys, selling them for $60 for a 60 pound bag. And but this is stuff that we already knew. So we were extremely practical. So it wasn't just this mystical, magical things. And also, if you look at where most tribal settlements were, they were along the rivers. They weren't out in the middle of the prairie. They weren't starting these places, these villages and stuff out in the middle of prairies. No, hunting parties would be out in the middle of prairies, but no, we understood the necessity for clean running water. We boiled our water. We understood, and we may not, considered it germ theory, or we may not have understood the concept of germs, but we knew and understood that you do certain things, you'll get sick. I mean, there was this incident with mice. and I think it was the Pueblo, and there's these Pueblo medicine men that were telling the white doctors, like, look, it's because of the mice. And they didn't understand that it was because of the microbes and the things, and that they were that they had inside of them and that they were carrying. And I don't know if it was, it was some sort of I don't think it was very well known, but even the doctors were stumped. And I think this was like in the mid 2000s or something. And sure enough, like, they tested these mice, and it was this sickness that was going around, but the medicine men knew about it because they had heard stories about the uncleanliness of these mice, and why people needed to get rid of them and all this kind of stuff.
Well,
So
it's like to say people say that is like, well, the Native Americans also didn't have neuroscience, but they realized that if you hit someone hard enough on the head with a club, they're going to act funny for a while.
yeah,
So they didn't have to have a precisely accurate understanding of science in order to reason cause and effect.
right, yeah, and
The
that
biggest problem, the biggest problem with the Native American relationship with Christianity in particular, like, I think most of them are Christians. Are I don't know the exact numbers, but guilt by association gets in the way of that.
yeah, and then, I mean, unfortunately, there's a lot of um there's not a lot of, and this is just a blanket statement, but you know I don't know, and I don't know why it's this way, but there's not a lot of, or a ton of, very strong biblical based Christians. And one of the things that I've theorized, is, what I've noticed is that most people, when they convert from the native practices, what they'll do is they have a tendency to sort of flow into charismania. They become very charismatic Christians, or they lean towards these Pentecostal groups. And some of that, and this is just my personal thought, is because one of the things that one of the shortfalls of American Christianity in particular is the fact that we have de-spiritualized a lot of Christianity, right?
Yeah.
There's you either have you have two there's a massive chasm, and there's people who are on the supernatural side, or there are people that are on the extremely unsupernatural side, right? God is performing miracles, but he's not performing miracles the way that he used to back in the Old Testament. And then there's people that are like, no, God performs miracles every single day, and he should. And if you don't, so there's these hyperism on both sides. But the thing is that most Native people, they have, and I've been to different ceremonies and things where I have seen, heard, and felt some very real things. And so there is a supernatural realm that is out there, and that's not a plug for Michael Heiser's book, but I mean,
Highly recommend.
yeah, I haven't read it yet, but I know enough about it, and I've heard enough of Heiser to understand. But there is a supernatural aspect of Native American culture that is still very relevant and real today. And see, the thing is it scares Christians, so they automatically want to go and demonize it, right? So, oh, that's done under the power, and so if you're talking about spirits and things and whatever, so automatically that means that they're demons. Well, hold on now, let's. And I was asked a very interesting question not too long ago by a practicing Native American. I don't even know if I want to call it religion, but the Native American faith. And he said, well, okay, so, because I was giving him the gospel message, and I was saying, look, there are things that we do within Native American culture that we no longer have to do anymore, because they were done through Christ. They were fulfilled through Christ. So there's a lot of ceremonial things that are within many Native American religious practices that are self-sacrificial, which is a fantastic concept, right? Because Christ called us to be self-sacrificial, right? But there are things that have spiritual repercussions due to the fact. So it really falls into the realm of works-based righteousness. And so I was communicating to him like, look, some of the things that you are doing, they don't need to be done anymore because we have the healer. We have the person that has reconciled all of the blessings. He's reconciled all the sins that have been done. And he hung on the cross and he has done the Sundance for us. He has done the skin offerings. He has drugged the skulls. These are different various forms of religious worship. So they do this dance called the Sundance, and they dance literally from sun up to sundown in the beating heat, and they fast the whole time, having very limited water. And it's really it's a self-sacrificial type thing because they're paying homage to Creator and thanking Him for the blessings that they have, and they're praying on behalf, and they're interceding on behalf of those who either won't pray or can't pray. So these are very honorable things, right? But again, so I was communicating to him that, listen, these things don't need to be done because Christ has fulfilled all those things. So he asked me the question, so, okay, so when did it turn from God honoring to demonic? Because um, because I am fully under the belief that God had made a way for people to come to him pre-Christ, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean the Romans talks about it, right? That there are even among the Gentiles, they might hold the law, but that becomes the law unto themselves, right? They might hold to the tenets of the law and understand the fact that God wants your faith, and they might hold to that, and it would therefore be counted to them as faith, just like Abraham was, right? It was counted to him. His faith was counted to him, and then he therefore became righteous. So again, so I do have that understanding and belief that pre-Christ, that there were ways that the people who were not the Jews, I'm sure, will see in heaven.
Right, like
And
the Greek philosophers, the Zoroastrians and Hindus.
yeah, I mean, there's and so that rubs American Christianity the very wrong way, because they have this Americanized ideology that, oh my gosh, there's no way, because they didn't go to church, or they didn't sing the great hymns, um so so that was a very poignant question. And so what I could tell him is, I said, look, I don't know, and I'm not trying to cop out. I said, but the thing is, though, is what I do know is that Christ has done these things for us, which deems those things. And now, because I am telling you about Christ and his sacrifice and what he has done, now you are therefore accountable. And I said, I know it's a strong and a very difficult thing to wrestle with. I said, but now you are under that. You have that decision. And that all I can do is pray that you would come to that understanding, and that you would be open enough to truly hear what I'm saying to you, because I'm not trying to condemn you or say that you are practicing Satan worship and all these types of things, because that he asked me directly, right? He said it to me directly because people have told him, because he's doing these things, he's worshiping Satan. So is that a fair assumption?
No.
You see what I'm saying? So automatically it's demon. And here's the thing, though, is because I was heavily reformed in my early teaching, and I sold out to reform culture. So a lot of me is still wrestling with this. So I'm trying to reconcile and trying to see and weed out the things that, what can we keep? What can we do? Because we all have an identity crisis because we're part of the human race. We're fallen people. So we all have this to a certain degree, right? Because we all want to practice sex sin. We all want to have multiple partners. We all want to, be unfaithful. I mean, I'm not saying we want to be, but I'm saying, we want to justify our sin, right? So
Yeah.
we all have this on a human level. So some of us just have it on a cultural level. So it's no different from the person who is trying to figure out who they are as an African American. There's a giant push now. There's some of these identity culture and our identity doctrine cults that are out there. Nation of Islam, the Black Hebrew Israelites, the Kemetic community, the conscious community. There's these identity doctrines that they're trying to reconcile themselves, who they are, and their spirituality, and it's just the same thing. It's the same battle, and so that doesn't mean that people with um, European ethnic descent don't have that problem. They still do. They have to they have to rectify their own culture within itself. So call it what you want. Call it American culture, but me and a good friend of mine, his name is Jordan Ortiz. He runs a ministry called Servant of Christ Ministries. We did a 2-part series called we called it PTSD. We called it presuppositional traumatic scripture disorder.
Yeah.
And so, but we were talking about, look, there's really these spheres or these circles, right? And they just all expand out. So it starts with, like, you have your own family culture that may be contrary to Christ, right? You have your own inner circle. Maybe your family isn't Christian. So now you have to shed that. You have a community. Maybe you come from a small community. Maybe you come from a large community, wherever you are, but you still have a community that you sort of, or just talk about so you're talking about your inner family, maybe your larger family. And then you got to shed that, and then you also have to your hometown community. You have to shed that, And so there's all these different things that we have to really try to reconcile. So no one's exempt from having to reconcile traditions, whether you be African American, whether you are from Africa, whether you are Native American, whether you're Hispanic, whether you're a white European, you have white European background. You still have a culture to have to try and see, like, what is it that I can keep? What is it that I have to throw away? And see, that's the part where it's difficult because most white evangelicals don't feel like they have that responsibility to do. They
I
only
think the
see it.
evangelicals are lost at this point.
Many, yeah, and I think the church is flooded with non-believers.
No, I mean they tend to go in two directions. One side of the evangelicals tends to go to the far right, MAGA cult of personality, and the other side go in American civic religion. And the other half of evangelicals fall into the woke religion and synchronize it with Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to say we have came up past the hour mark.
We're all tonight.
Yeah. So, yeah. I had a lot of fun though. Can you tell the good people, Mr. Fox, about upcoming projects you have? Tell them again, where they can find you and like.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You can find me, like I said, on all the socials. Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook at Mr.Phil Fox, and or you can just Google search Mr.Phil Fox, or you can go to YouTube and search. Um, I don't have anything particularly scheduled yet, but I'm working on a few shows starting in September. Is when I'll be back. I have my we have a vacation that we're planning right now. We haven't been back to my home state. We're planning on going back to my reservation So we're going to do some ministry there, see some family and some friends. We're going to be doing that for a couple weeks, and then as soon as we get back, then we'll be transitioning to start of school. I have two daughters that are still school age, so we'll be getting ready for school, and then so starting in September, I have a couple shows that I have ideas for. Still working out some of the logistics, but we'll be getting back to our regular schedule. I usually go on at 4 o'clock Eastern on Sundays, so that's our normal schedule. And then you can also find me on most Friday nights. You'll find me on BK Apologist channel. He does a weekly show called Bodega Bible Talk. We just talk about different events, pop culture stuff, and sort of see where it conflicts with the Christian worldview. And we just sort of, it's lighthearted. We have a lot of fun, but we also get into some very real apologetic issues when it comes to that.
That's BK Apologist, you said?
Yep, BK Apologist. Yep, and then yeah, and I run with the Urban Apologetics community. There's some of us been accused of being quote unquote woke and stuff like that, but we try to keep a balanced biblical approach and contextualizing the gospel to help communicate the gospel to people who otherwise wouldn't hear it or receive it. So so we've been accused of being woke, but we're definitely not the CRT toting types.
Oh yeah, that sounds just basically just Marxist garbage. It replaces the class struggle with that of race, but
yeah, and
So
that's a completely different conversation.
yeah.
winning
Well,
in
before I have one more question for you. Does
Sure.
the power of Christ compel you?
I was wondering if that was going to come up because I'd watched a couple other interviews, and yes, the power of Christ is definitely compels me, and I understand and know my position in Christ, that I'm a royal priesthood, a holy people, and I'm part of a holy nation, which is the church, and I. Although I don't personally believe that we should be trying to wrestle demons and all that kind of stuff, because even the archangel didn't want to wrestle with, and he invoked the name of the Lord. So I think we need to rely on Christ and his power for that kind of stuff. So I'm not out trying to be an exorcist by any means, sprinkling holy water and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, appreciate you guys having me on. Absolutely. I appreciate this opportunity, and really I enjoy your guys' content. It's cool to sort of get a different take on all these types of things, and all the the philosophical aspects and stuff. It's challenging because I'm not that's not really my area of focus. So it's cool to look at different epistemological different views and those types of things. So it's been a blessing to look and see and hear some of your guys' content.
Thank you.
All right, dear audience, you know what to do.